Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome you all to the Institute of World Politics. For those of you who aren't aware, we're a graduate school of national security and international affairs. We always pursue a greater understanding of all of the affairs of state and all of the affairs of states. We're very happy this afternoon to welcome Professor Barbara Billauer, one of our visiting fellows, to give a lecture this afternoon on scientific statecraft. Professor Billauer has a great deal of academic expertise. All of her degrees have been granted from institutions in the great state of New York. Cornell University, Hofstra University. She has a degree in law from Hofstra. She's also studied occupational health and safety and bioethics. And she's taught at New York University and SUNY Stony Brook, I believe. And I believe Dr. Billauer is also a reviewer at the American Journal of Public Health. She's been a trial attorney in environmental issues and bioethics, medical malpractice, and other issues like that for many years. And she's the founder of the Foundation for Law and Science Centers, which teaches judges many issues regarding science and the role of law and health and public policy. I'm very glad to welcome Dr. Barbara Billauer.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming on this really hot summer afternoon. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to introduce you to what is really a new avenue of statecraft. Statecraft obviously is one of the key motivating factors, the raison d'etre of the Institute of World Politics, teaching all different aspects of statecraft. There are many, many courses, as you all know, dealing with different aspects. And one of the ones that is not taught, because it's not really focused on, is scientific statecraft. And Professor Linchowski gave me the opportunity to develop this field. And we're going to see where it takes us, and it's really very interesting. So the first question that I always ask is, why do we need a field, a discipline, devoted to science in statecraft? And as you all probably know, statecraft is the art of governing, how we govern. Well, there are different opportunities, different courses in the IWP, policy, economic statecraft. Today we're going to talk about science. But why science? What's so important about science as a driving paradigm of making policy decisions? So the first question, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. Which countries advanced most rapidly and dramatically on the world scene in the last 15 years? Hands, ideas.
South Korea.
All right.
China.
China. That's usually the first one I get is China.
India.
India. That's the second one I get is India.
Brazil.
Brazil. That's the third one I get is Brazil. Keep going, you're on a roll.
Malaysia.
Malaysia. And that's interesting, Malaysia. Yes, Malaysia. You see Iran has done pretty well. I mean, we may not like what they're doing, but they certainly, 15 years ago, you wouldn't call Iran a player on the world team. Would you call Iran a player on the world team now? Yeah, okay. Not a positive player, but a player. There was someone else.
Singapore.
Singapore. Well, Singapore has always, what I'm talking about is something growth. Singapore is one of my favorite countries, but I don't see, they've always been at the cutting edge.
What was the original question again? I forgot.
Which countries have emerged, have gone from relative sleepiness or nothingness to a world player? China, India, Brazil in the last 15 years, Malaysia would certainly qualify for that. So Singapore, I think, has always been in kind of cutting edge in their own little idiosyncratic fashion, but they have. And by the way, just to give you an example, Singapore is, I think, #2 on the World Health Organization's list of life expectancy. So we're really very, very high up. So Singapore has always been cutting edge. All right, but let's just take those four. Next question. When did the Iranians begin to escalate their nuclear program? Who helped them? And did the U.S. know about it, and do we do anything? Guesses?
I think we knew about it. We didn't do anything, but I don't know who was helping them.
Yes, okay.
Might have been a bit of help from Pakistan.
Not too far.
There was the botched Operation Merlin in which the CIA inadvertently gave nuclear weapon plans to Iran.
all right, but who was the main, where do you think their main source? Russia?
China.
Russia came from it. The year actually was 1998. And, excuse me, what's your name?
Charmaine.
As Charmaine pointed out, we knew about it, and we didn't do anything. You're gonna say, huh? What's going on here? And so here we are dealing with it today in a totally different world framework with a lot less options because they're this farther along. How come we didn't take notice of it in 1998? Third question. Who coordinates science, terrorism, and cyber policy and cybersecurity policy in the United States? Loud, deafening roar.
Maybe CENTCOM?
Trick question.
Trick question. Okay? And what's the effect of no coordinated science policy? And that's what we're going to go into in a second. If no one's finding the story. So, there are 18 ministries in the world, or actually there are 21, exclusively dealing with science and technology. Cabinet secretaries or ministries. I don't have Malaysia on here, but Malaysia is one of them. I just picked Brazil, China, Taiwan, India, Iran, Israel, Japan, and Russia. There are a couple of others among them, Malaysia. There are 7 ministries, at least, that have a ministry or a department or a cabinet level office that's called Education and Science, or in Britain it's called Universities and Science, France, UK, Scotland, Iceland, Lithuania, Macedonia. But of the 18 ministries that are exclusively, look at that list. Does that really tell you something? Now the interesting thing is Israel actually changed the name of it. It used to be the Ministry of Science, Technology, and now it's the Ministry of Science, Technology, and Space as of last year. Which gives you some sense of the mindset of the people at the top. What's doing in the United States? We don't have a cabinet office for science. Who coordinates science policy in the United States?
Commerce?
What?
Energy maybe?
There is an Office of Science in the Department of Energy, but their focus is on research, and actually they are the preeminent funder of research in physics.
Maybe Department of Defense?
Department of Defense has DARPA and has groups in the Department of Defense, but they're doing funding or development. So what you're giving me is, yes, there are cabinet secretaries or cabinet divisions that do focus on science, but their focus is on research devoted to their own aegis. Who's running the store? Who is coordinating? And the answer is, the president has, in the executive, under the executive mandate, a presidential science advisor and a science council. The president's science advisor's name is John Holdren. He has a degree of, I believe, from MIT in astrophysics, but his area of expertise is environmental policy and global change. The number 2 person of the Office of Science, the Presidential Office of Science, called the Office of Science Policy, is a psychologist and linguist. The number 3 person who is in charge of cyber work would be the chief technology officer, the chief information officer in the corporation, is a businessman who has no advanced degree in science. Are you getting a little nervous here? Now, what is the big problem with this? The big problem with this is that this is a partisan organization. These are not people looking at science from an objective evaluation standpoint. Once upon a time, between 1972 and 1995, we had something called the Office of Technology, the Office of Technology. And that was a congressional office made up of 12 members, 6 Republicans and 6 Democrats. And their job was to oversee policy from a nonpartisan perspective. It was a nonpartisan group. Now, any policy science-related, that comes out of the government, the only oversight actually comes from the OMB. They don't do a bad job. I mean, they actually do a pretty good job, although with the Obamacare, they kind of changed their minds afterwards, but that's the best we get. And it's from, obviously, from an economic perspective, not from, is this a good idea perspective. Where does this leave us if there's no one running the store from a global, what's good for the United States perspective? So, the OTA, Office of Technology Assessment, died in 1995. The people there were really pretty upset. They made out t-shirts for themselves saying, how come the Congressional Office gets, the Office of Congress, the Congressional Library of Congress gets money, and we don't. They were pretty upset, and it is really a very sad situation. So, before we get to where we get, we are now in a situation where science is pretty much, at least in many countries, many of the leading countries, many of the countries that are advancing rapidly on the world scene, moving quickly, and there is no agency in the United States that's looking at our science policy from a expert and a nonpartisan perspective. Now, where did that leave us? This is really interesting. In 2002, there was a war game, a bioterrorism war game called Dark Winter. It was set up by an NGO, and it created this scenario where, in the space of a month, 1 million people would die. As a result of that, we got funding for bioterrorism. At present, the funding for bioterrorism is about $12 billion. In addition to that funding, we have other funding for biodefense. I'm not sure what the difference is. Will tell you what these grew for $60 billion. Now, what have we done with all this money? Well, this is what they did at this Dark Winter scenario. They invited past high-level government officials. The former associate, Sam Nunn played the president, and all the great luminaries that you could think of were out of office, who knew nothing from science. And the supposed scientists who created this very flawed and fraudulent document, it was criticized years later by the Army, hyped up a hysteria based on no facts whatsoever, but since nobody in the group knew anything about science, and didn't even have the intelligence to say, Google, tell me, is this true? They just accepted what the scientists said, hook, line, and sinker. The problem with the scientists is that they don't know very much about politics. And so the Dark Winter scenario was about smallpox, and this is what was part of the documents, and it was a pure hysteria-producing documents, and that's what resulted in all of this expenditures, including at least 5 universities funded, dozens of professors getting jobs, dozens of people getting jobs, and now we've got supposedly a bioterrorism or a bioweapon program. Now I'm going to show you how effective that is in one second. So what's going on now? We've got all this. We've got bioterrorism. It's under DARPA does some, BARDA, from the Department of Health and Human Services does some, Homeland Security has some responsibility. Okay, so what's going on now? We've got smallpox, anthrax, SARS, Ebola, MERS, measles. What's happening? Do we have a policy for Ebola? Anybody scared of Ebola? Yes? No?
I would assume the CDC would have some sort of a policy for that.
CDC, great. My favorite or non-favorite. In 2003, when the SARS epidemic was going on, CDC issued a travel advisory banning travel, and basically quarantined. The whole world was under quarantine. They snuck under the radar screen a CDC doctor who was in Taiwan very quietly. They didn't tell anybody about it. Now they authorized 2 people to come back from South Africa who were being treated at Emory University. No, come on in, guys. There's one person who was found at Mount Sinai, who checked himself into Mount Sinai Hospital in New York. But he doesn't have it, but we're not sure. And they wait, the tests come back, and they come back false positives and false negatives. last week, no, 2 days ago, a woman was admitted herself to University of New Mexico Hospital. She'd just been in Sierra Leone, complaining of flu. But we don't think she's got Ebola. She just has all the symptoms of Ebola. She's got flu in August. Flu season doesn't start till October. They hadn't got around, she checked herself in last Saturday. They hadn't gone around to taking the test to send to CDC. The CDC is supposed to turn around their tests in 2 days. In New York, they turned around after 3 days. The false negative and false positive rates are so totally screwy that you can't depend on them. And so, yeah, they've got a policy which they are breaching right and left. Now, CDC, anthrax. Last month, 80 people were exposed to anthrax at CDC when they just kind of lost a couple of vials of anthrax. They forgot to comply with the safety regulations, and 80 people were exposed. So what did CDC say? It's not so dangerous. How could it not be so dangerous? Anthrax is listed as a Class A bioterrorism agent until they expose their own people. They have no tests. Well, they have tests. They have no treatment, and they have no vaccine. If you want to do something really interesting, go to the FDA website and look at the package insert for anthrax vaccine. It's not tested, and it's not licensed. It says right on the vaccine, this vaccine is not tested as supposed to, and they're giving it to their people.
I got it, yeah.
Okay. You might think twice next
Oh,
time. Next time. It's never been tested. Okay, MERS. MERS is the analog, well, it's a new edition of SARS. It's Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. MERS is fascinating because it's primarily affecting Saudi Arabia. There are about 600 people who've got MERS now. And they've just trained, Obama just changed the executive order on quarantine to quarantine anybody that looks like, smells like they've got MERS, even if they're not any likelihood that they might be contagious. Measles, oh wait, I live in Israel now, which is going to be very interesting because there's a lot going on in Israel. And I came in through customs the day before yesterday, and for the first time I've ever seen they have health advisors. Measles, big health advisory. MERS, big health. There are 3 cases of MERS in the United States. One was a false positive, but they don't care anymore. The new regulations say even false positives we can quarantine. It's not based on science. It's based on if it has the capability, which is an opinion-based criteria. Avian flu. Now this was okay. So avian flu. They have these 3 big signs for Ebola, MERS, and measles. Then they have these television screens for avian flu in China with that strain, H7N9. CDC last week said H7N9 is not pathogenic. It doesn't cause disease. Then you read a couple pages, well, it's low pathogenic. But now you come into customs, beware people come in from China with avian flu H7N9. Last month, CDC by accident sent out the virulent form, H5N1 of avian flu, to a biosafety level biosafety level 3 lab, where they're doing work on that, and they combined the 2. In other words, they combined and created a new organ. But this isn't dangerous until you come here. So the policy of CDC has one is of absolute contradiction. It's a bioterrorist agent, it's a bioterrorist agent until there are people exposed, and then it's not a problem. Okay, so which countries have advanced dramatically? The ones which have a policy. It fuels growth in world prestige. We know about the Iranians. We know about security and defense. And we know about science, policy, personal advancement. The people who benefit are government agencies. There's a government agency that's devoted to vaccines. Vaccines is probably the worst use of funding because they're disease specific. If I had a pot of money, I'd rather use antibiotics, antivirals, which have a broad spectrum use. Vaccine is disease. But there is a government agency just for vaccines, and those people have a vested interest in keeping their department open. So, how are we going to look at, let's assume we're sitting here and we want to create an organized framework for looking at science policy. There are various ways to do it. We can look at examples of other countries, what they're doing, and adopt them. We can identify policy objectives and say, how can we use science to accomplish what we want to achieve? We need to understand principles of science in order to find out what science can do. we can look at tools of scientific statecraft, which I'm going to do, and then we can organize a framework so that we're not operating piecemeal in the abstract, which is what we're doing now. We have different groups, but nobody's coordinating, as in the other one. Here's some examples. This is what Obama said in 2009. He wanted to appoint science envoys to collaborate in the Middle East to do green jobs, digitized records, clean water, growth new crops. And one of his objectives was to incorporate an educational exchange between the US and Muslim countries around the world. That was the 2009 speech. And he wanted to start a new fund to support science and technology development in Muslim-majority countries. He focused on, it was interesting, he didn't focus on the Middle East, which is what I would normally expect a president to do if I want to identify a segment as a third world country, Africa, like he's doing now. He identified it by religion, which I thought was unusual, but that was obviously a focus. So he realizes that emissaries in teaching science is a good thing to do to what he called Muslim-speaking countries. But I want to look at some hard, and what happened to that, nobody's kept up with that. This is something he wanted to do. When he did it, there's no indication that he actually did. Since I live in Israel, which is has anyone read Startup Nation? Okay, Startup Nation is a book about how Israel transformed itself from a wilderness 60 years ago to a leading player. But I'm going to just show you, by way of example, how Israel used science just by reading the newspaper. So one of Israel's major policy objectives is immigration. It's very important for Israel. Now, if you see there, this is a diagram about nanotechnology. What does nanotechnology have to do with immigration? In 2008, Israel started they declared nanotechnology a priority. They start an initiative. They built 6 nanotech centers. They have 206 patents, collaborations between academia and industry, collaborations all over the place. And in the last 3 years, 101 world-class scientists have immigrated to Israel. Now, it's nice, Israel doesn't care. I mean, they want immigration of any kind. But if you could get 100 world-class scientists coming in, that's not bad. So here's an example of science driving a policy objective. Here's another one. Cyber warfare, world leadership. And I said, I'm focusing on Israel because I read the Israeli papers, and here it is. According to a NATO document, hacktivists, new word, can be killed under the rules of cyber warfare. Last year, the former deputy head of the Israel Defense Forces wrote a 149-page, the first manual on dealing with the legal aspects of cyber warfare. This is now the example. This is used as the paradigm for how to deal with cyber criminals. So here you have a small country using science to propel themselves to the leader, because there's no place else to go. Another example, green initiatives. So Israel now has an initiative to green the Knesset, the government building, in conjunction with the Technion's environmental school. They have made it an objective to green, as if the White House decided we're going to make the White House green in conjunction with the City Department of Architecture. They have made a decision to do this. This is now an example for the rest of the world to follow. Economic collaborations. So, this is all of the last 4 months. Everything I'm telling you now is in the last 4 months. Just pulling out of the newspaper. 4 months ago, the University of Canada's University of Waterloo from Canada decides that they're going to have an agreement about groundwater nanotechnology, and the purpose of it is to facilitate technology transfer. So here they're using science as a means to foster economics. Clinical trials. United Kingdom. You don't think the United Kingdom would, on its own, very important country, it's got its own stuff. Last month, they enter into an agreement with Teva, which is the Israeli main pharmaceutical company, to do a research project on clinical development for dementia. Very interesting, dementia, they identify dementia as a new light or blight that's going to affect the whole world. And now they're going to foster an agreement with dementia, on drug with dementia. And the UK, Cameron says, science collaborations are the strongest building blocks of UK-Israeli ties. So here we have collaborations on science all related to that. Now this is actually one of the most fascinating, the internet. There are many Israeli Arabs, and much of the Arab culture does not foster information for women. And so some Israeli entrepreneurs put out a training manual on breastfeeding directed to the Israeli Arabs in Arabic. Because the Arab mentality doesn't care more than they don't direct themselves. And what happened was 50% of the viewers came from outside of Israel, from Saudi Arabia, 16% from Egypt, 9% from Iraq, and 75%, which is basically 75% of viewers came from outside, from Arab-speaking people outside of Israel. This is the only facility in Arabic that dealt with the needs of women in Arabic. Okay, so in order for us to, I'm going to go do this part quickly, design a scientific work scenario, you need to understand what is science. Why is science different from economics or something else? And basically science is knowledge. The word science comes from knowledge. It's an objective method of study, and that's why in some ways science and scientists can bridge a gap and see things that politicians can't because they're trained to look at things from both sides. They're trained to look at things objectively. Not all, but that's part of it. And it's a systemic system. So there's a system of looking at things from a logical standpoint as opposed to from an emotional standpoint, which most of us come out of this, my side's right, your side's right. There are, by the way, I'm going to show you instances where scientists get very caught up in my side and your side too. But generally, it's supposed to be objective. And science is the opposite of magic. So what's magic? Magic is we don't really understand what we're doing. In science, we either understand what we're doing or we can repeat what we're doing over and over again and predict the same results. So there's a basic, I can't disagree with you because this is what happens. There's a basic element of not necessarily truth in the old-fashioned way, but truth in the sense that we all expect the same outcome. When we all expect the same outcome, you're dealing with something that brings people together. And if I had time, I would give you examples of what happened. These are some of the principles which I'm really not going to go into now that we need to understand in terms of how the scientific mindset works. And if it were employed, it could be used to develop a scientific basis. One of the things that science relies on is religion is not science. And science relies on the fact that I can falsify things. So you can falsify religion. Religion is not science because you believe, I believe, whatever. But science is objective, I can prove it. Now here's where you get fraud science. You get fraud science, you get people who fake their science. There's a lot of fraud science, I'm sure everybody's read in the magazine, scientists have put forth fraudulent information. Haeckel was the person who advanced one of the theories of evolution. It turned out that he doctored his diagrams in the 1800s, and 100 years later, even when I was in college, we believed it. So basically, science is provable except when people have an interest in the outcome, which today people do, because most of the universities today in the United States are funded by what the scientists go out and bring. In other words, they have to get their own income. So they work for, not on projects that are necessarily of interest, but on projects that somebody wants to fund. That's the science that you need magic to make it work. Now here's my science is better than your science. I didn't do that. But in the around 1900, there were two scientists. One was Ilya Metchnikoff and one was Paul Ehrlich. Metchnikoff said that the immune system was governed by the white blood cells, And Ehrlich said it was the red blood cells, and they're beating each other, screaming, yelling, and these people could have been advocates today, my side, mine. Turns out they were both right. But screaming and yelling is something that scientists also do, so they're not perfect. This is the first. Okay, here are some tools of scientific statecraft that can be used. Pure research, which we're doing now. We do all sorts of research. DARPA does research on interesting and cutting-edge defense. Conferences. Now, conferences I have plus and minuses because you can use conferences proactively and negatively. The boycott and defense movement uses scientific conferences or any educational conference on a negative basis. There's negative use of statecraft. Joint collaboration, research, and technology, we saw some examples. Now, aid is very interesting because there are various venues of aid, various types of aid. Of course, we give aid, straight people give straight aid, humanitarian aid. Oprah gave aid to a girls' school, and she found out it was misused. But she tried. The Gates Foundation, of course, gives money for malaria research. Technical assistance, we give money for technical assistance. And research sharing, we try and we provide resources to other countries when they're having problems, such that so there were some of the American Ebola health people were American. Here are some more tools. International policing. So we have global warming treaties. The environmental accords are used. International standards of bioethics and cloning. That's what's governing that we don't have human bioethics. Those are international standards that come out of UNESCO. Quarantine and travel regulations. The World Health Organization is supposed to coordinate that. Bioterrorism research is supposed to be a moratorium and international treaty not to do it. I don't know if it's honored. And then we have international standard setting. How you read certain x-rays, occupational diseases, the standards are set by the International Labor Organization. And the last time I was here, I talked about the scientist as an orchestrator, as an active participant in making policy happen, which I'll talk about toward the end. Benjamin Franklin was the first person. Benjamin Franklin, as you all know, was successful in forging the treaty between the United States and France, both comedy and both in terms of the peace agreement. 6 months before Benjamin Franklin was sent to France, the United States sent 2 lawyers, Silas Deane and Andrew Lee. And they got no place. Benjamin Franklin arrives in Paris December 24th, Christmas Eve, December 23rd. He sends his grandson to Vergennes, who is the foreign minister, and December 24th, Christmas Eve, Franklin is sitting in Vergennes' office. How did that happen? 6 months before with Dang Bang, and the reason was, as much as Franklin wanted to meet Vergennes, Vergennes wanted to meet Franklin because Franklin was probably the leading scientist of the day. Vergennes had actually sent his own spies to England to monitor Franklin going back years. So because of his stature, he had a certain credibility that nobody else had. And the interesting thing is, we'll get to Franklin later, because of Franklin's prestige and stature, he was given a reception that the by and large American would not have. And part of the reason is because one country to another country, we all have our prejudices. We come with prejudices. Somehow scientists manage to, not all, overcome that. And so there are 2 ways of looking at building a discipline of scientific statecraft. One, looking at the tools, which is probably the way one might do it if we weren't serious about it, but how much time do we have left?
Oh, we've got at least 20 minutes.
Okay.
And then questions after.
And then questions. But for the purposes we have now, one way that I'm going to try and portray it is via people because it leaves a lasting impression. So we start with the elements of statecraft. My husband, Dr. Bailey, who is a professor here, has quantified scientific statecraft into 6 elements. Diplomacy, propaganda, economics, subversion, military display, and war. So another way of looking at scientific statecraft is to see how science or scientists have been used in those elements. What has science or scientists done to foster those of the acknowledged or recognized elements of statecraft? So we start with diplomacy. Now the interesting thing about Benjamin Franklin, okay, there you go. By the way, when he was in England, clever, when he was in England, he dressed with the big wigs and the fancy clothes. When he goes to France, he has this totally different demeanor. He adopts the Davy Crockett school of what people expected an American to look like. He puts on a coonskin cap. Now that coonskin cap, by the way, was sable, but you don't need to know that. He's wearing a sable cap. He's wearing a brown velvet suit, very plain. And he captivates the country because he dresses the part of what people think Americans should look like. The leading French intellectual of the day was a guy named Comte Buffon. And he said Americans were subhuman. He regarded the Native American. The Native American was not the Indian. It was us, our forefathers, as degenerated variety of humans. And the savage, that's the rest of us. We were considered the savages. You know, the people who came over from Mayflower, all of us people, we're the savages in Buffon's mind. The organs of the generation are small and feeble. He has no hair, no beard, no ardor for the female. He's timid and cowardly. He has no vivacity and no activity of mind. And then Ben Franklin comes on the scene, and they become really good friends. Apparently they used to talk about Madame de Pompadour, and Comte Buffon had gallstones, and he would talk to them. But they become really, really good friends. And Buffon has to realize, Jesus, maybe he's got to review his preconceived notion about Americans, because here's Ben Franklin. The prejudice was so strong that apparently there was one dinner, and there were a whole bunch of French people on one side, a whole bunch of Americans on the side, and the person who succeeded Franklin was Thomas Jefferson. Well, there are all these Americans, and Thomas Jefferson's there, and Ben Franklin's there, and they're talking about the Americans being small and degenerate and tiny little people and all. And Ben Franklin would I would like to do an experiment. Well, all you French people stand up, and all the French people stood up, and people in France, men are pretty, for the most part, short. And they all stand up. Now the Americans stand up, and all Ben Franklin's there, and Tom Jefferson's there, and all these tall Americans coming there. And he was able to eviscerate this prejudice about the American being a degenerate sub-level person because of his own personal stature. And because of that, he was given a credibility that the lawyers, sorry, I'm a lawyer, did not get. Although his science, now, his level of science was highly recognized. He was actually inducted into the French Academy of Science by Louis XV. So he had had a whole series of French contacts which he had built up over the years, and his scientific network also helped him. So here's one example of his scientific persona enabled him to accomplish that which trained diplomats were not able to do. Okay, so the next thing we get is propaganda. Now this is not, or national pride. And of course, I don't know how many people, well, if there are people here who remember going on to the moon, yes. Remember those days, remember? Has anybody else remember being there? You can't describe the aura, right? Could you possibly describe the feeling of just like, wow?
That's right.
It was like, wow. The feeling of, look what we did. It gave you the sense, wow, we're Americans, and we're proud to be Americans, because look what we did. And it wasn't at the expense of anybody else. We didn't cut anybody else's. It wasn't a war. It was, we conquered space. And it was in this amazing sense of national pride. And once you walk around with this sense of national pride, it carries around. It's a sense of majesty. It's like, here we are, and we're willing to share our science and our scientific accomplishment. It was an astounding time. So we know that. JFK, I believe this nation should be commit itself to achieving the goal before the decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. He had a vision. He saw the future. He had a circumscribed vision. He could see it, he could convey the vision. That's what a good politician can do. He conveyed his vision, and it was achieved. So here's an example of science accomplishing national pride. And I think today probably, science is probably the one place where you can accomplish national pride not at the expense of somebody else. We don't have to show we're better by killing somebody. We can show we're better because we cured cancer or did something for the best benefit of the world. Okay. This is is really interesting. Go back. Here's another example of propaganda. The Balfour Declaration. How many people know about the Balfour Declaration? The Balfour Declaration was put out supposedly as a propaganda document. That's the way it's called. Why? I'm not exactly sure. The purpose of it was, from the British standpoint, is that they wanted to get as much support as possible. Before they were willing to go forward with it, they wanted Wilson to sign on to it. At that point, Wilson was a pacifist. He wasn't signing on to anything. And the Balfour Declaration basically said that the land of Palestine should be a Jewish state, a Jewish homeland. A lot of negotiation back and forth as to the language. Justice Brandeis was the person who ultimately influenced Wilson to sign on. But the question is, what got the British even to that standpoint? Because there was a lot of dissension even in the British Parliament as should this be done, shouldn't this be done. Chaim Weizmann, that's Balfour over there, that's Chaim Weizmann the second over there. Chaim Weizmann, who is the first president of Israel, was a scientist. Does anybody, people know this? Okay. What did he do? Well, in 1915, in the middle of the war, Britain suffered what's called the British shell crisis. They didn't have enough ammunition. The Germans had pretty much co-opted all of the supply of acetone, which was needed to make explosives. And so, in 1915, there was a battle, and the British pretty much used up all their ammunition. They didn't have anything. And what Weizmann did is he found a bacterial way of making acetone artificially. He's called the father of industrial fermentation. And because of that, the British were able to have enough ammunition to help win the war. What happened was, the shell crisis of 1915 brought down the Asquith government. Right after that, David Lloyd George became Minister of Munitions. Weizmann pretty much saved David Lloyd George's hide. When Lloyd George became Prime Minister, he felt a certain allegiance to Weizmann, who didn't charge for any of this. And it wasn't necessarily quid pro quo, but there was a certain of, well, we couldn't have done it without Weizmann, and so this is what I'm going to do to foster him. It was not the only reason, but there's no question, if you look at the chronology of events, that Weizmann's patenting of acetone for the British, he didn't keep the patent for himself, was one of the things that Lloyd George felt indebted to. If you read Weizmann's own papers, he poo-poos that. He goes, no, it was because of me, and I was so great, and he was so friends with C.P. Snow, who was the editor of the Manchester Guardian. But if you look at the chronology of events, David Lloyd George did not talk to him about Zionism until after the acetone discovery. So there was an example of Weizmann helping with this propaganda paper of the Balfour Declaration. Okay, this is one of my favorites. DDT and malaria. In 1973, this was the U.S. production of DDT. Now, for those of you who were in school in 1973, as I was, we were taught that DDT is the world's most terrible thing because it causes all sorts of things, including breast cancer and everything else. What it does do, by the way, is it weakens the shell of birds, bird shells. And Professor Keaton, who was one of the people who discovered this, was my biology teacher. Terrible. And so as a consequence of that, we started diminishing production of DDT. DDT was regarded as the most horrible thing in the world because it killed bird shells. And if you look at this chart, as DDT production decreased rather, malaria increased. And now they're going back to DDT. So here's an example of the adverse issue of science and world deaths. Now they're going back and they're using DDT, but people like that woman is Rachel Carson and Paul Ehrlich, and the people who believe that it was so terrible without really enough science were able to stop the reduction of it. And I think I have an affecting the economy of Africa and the U.S. Malaria is responsible for a growth penalty of 1.3% a year. So as we stopped furnishing DDT, we have, unfortunately, responsible for a lot of the economic decline of Africa because of the influence of malaria.
And then,
When you say they are starting to use DDT, who were they?
And we went, the United States was producing DDT.
Right, but you're saying now as malaria is now more of a problem, we've gone back to.
We're producing more DDT now. I think Monsanto is producing it, but I'm not sure.
so what's the direct causation between DDT prevalence and malaria?
Okay, DDT is the single most effective solution to malaria.
In what terms?
Okay, DDT wipes out the mosquito that carries malaria. Nothing else comes close. They have tried. In fact, I think I have a slide that. Okay, here. They used other substances, and as the other mosquitoes got a certain tolerance to it, it's man against the chemical. So the mosquitoes develop a tolerance, they put in other chemicals, and before you know it, nothing else works but DDT. So now what they're doing is they're doing two things. They're doing malaria nets. The problem with malaria nets is that in order to be effective, you pretty much can't breathe. They have to be so dense, and they're impregnated with chemicals anyway. So they're finally beginning to admit that DDT is the only thing that really works. And it's not as bad as anybody ever thought. It does not cause breast cancer. I did the research on this myself. It probably does cause thinning of bird shells. But when you think about cost-benefit analysis, the economic impact of malaria, especially in Africa, is huge. Something about it?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know the science, but you know, there was science out there at one time that showed that cigarette smoking wasn't harmful to your health, that global warming isn't happening, and vice versa. I don't know. It seems.
I know.
I would have to see the science.
I did it. Well, I'll give you the citation.
Yeah, well.
Okay.
Like you said, there
I'm
were
not talking
scientists
about.
on
I'm not
cigarettes
okay.
too.
And that's the problem. People who haven't studied the science pick up the Rachel Carsons, and they pick it up, and it sounds convincing, and it sounds really good. When you start looking at it, it's just not there. But we've been brainwashed by a lot of this stuff, and because there are not people who are schooled in both policy and science, okay, you're picking up what you heard. What you need to do is go back yourself, not take and check and see that, and that was the problem with Dark Winter. A whole bunch of policy people came and they listened to what the scientists said, and the scientists misrepresented the facts. And the danger is people who don't know the science will just, well, we heard, and okay, so she says this and he says this, without having the facility to go back and check yourself.
Yeah. So DDT is effective at preventing the spread of malaria.
Well, killing the mosquitoes that
That's
transmit
right.
it.
And is simultaneously not harmful to people.
It's not harmful to people. There
At all.
is no evidence that it's harmful to people. None.
Okay, I'll do that.
But check it.
I will.
And I'll give you my email address and you can welcome to correspond. Now that's the point. There has to be an interest in the policymakers to check it themselves and not to rely on scientists who have a vested interest in the outcome. A lot of these people, and Paul Ehrlich wrote a book, and all these people wrote books and made a lot of money on it.
So it was supposedly harmful to who? People in the United States, in Africa, or what is the correlation?
Initially, what it was put out, what we were told is that it is an absolute carcinogen, causes breast cancer. And I checked myself, okay? I went through the literature. And they said it wasn't DDT, it was breakdown product DDE. Check myself. There is no evidence whatsoever that DDT is harmful to humans. Now, having said that, it does harm birds, and you don't want to disrupt the ecology. However, given the horrors of malaria, it's one thing if DDT causes harm to humans, but if it doesn't, you've got to start looking at the risk-benefit analysis and make a weighed decision. And without my telling you what the decision should be, my point is, don't just accept because, I'm sorry, what's your name?
I'm Chris.
Chris. The common belief, I mean, I still have Paul Ehrlich's book, and I still have the stuff that I had when I was in college about how terrible this stuff is. The site, the hype, and there was huge hype. you've got to check the data yourself. And that's why it's important to have at least a facility to go back and inquire and check both sides. Okay? Subversion. This person over there is one of my most fascinating characters. Does anybody, I'm sure you don't recognize who this is. This person's name is Aaron Aronson. That picture was probably done in 1910 or something like that. Aaron Aronson discovered what's called mother wheat, the original wheat, and proved that the cradle of civilization started in the Levant because he found it in the north of Israel. And there were all sorts of belief about how it was going to create enough food for the world. It never did. But because of his science, he was invited as a guest of the United States government. And he and David Fairchild, if anyone wants to check, who is the U.S. Department of Agriculture's seed production person and was responsible for bringing in a huge amount of fruit and vegetables in the States that we didn't have, collaborated, and a lot of the dates and the fruits that we have now and back and forth were sent from Israel. Fairchild then commissioned Aronson to go to Egypt, because he spoke Arabic also, and look for dates, certain kinds of dates. So there was and he acted as pretty much a scientific repository around the world for sending, he had a seed bank, and he spread different kinds of fruits and vegetable seeds around the world. He also, on top of being an agronomist, was a hydrogeologist. And he was probably one of the leading scientists in Israel at the time, and was an advisor to the Turkish government, who ruled Israel. In 1915, there was a huge locust epidemic in Israel, and if you see pictures, you would absolutely, I think, was astounded. And as an advisor to the Turkish government, he toured the country. So he knew everything that was going on. He saw troop movements, and under the watchful eye of the Turkish, he got all of the information of who's going where, what's moving here, and what the trains were. And he was also a hydrologist, so he knew where all the water supplies were. In 1915, when his sister was coming back, she was in Turkey. She came back from Turkey to Israel, and she watched the Armenian genocide happening. And told her brother that what was happening between what the Turks were doing and what the Germans were doing with their collaboration was a horror, and was a harbinger of things to come. But Aronson said if you had the horror of the Turkish people that he saw at the time, with the ability of the Germans to work in such a clinical, effective manner, it would be absolutely horrible. And at that point, they decided to switch their allegiance from being Turkish, which most people were at the time, to being an ally of the British. And he decided, one of the first people, he was ostracized. I mean, he lived around the corner from me, by the way. And there's a museum, and I spent months in the museum going through his papers. He decided that the allegiance should be to the British. He was one of the first people who started mobilizing allegiance to the British. And because he knew the troop movements, and he knew the water supply, and he has all this information, and his sister, Sarah, actually ran the spy operations called the Neely Spy Ring. And if you feminists want to read about it, one of the early female spies. It's really interesting. They tried to get the information to the British. Now, he is a Turkish citizen, living in a Turkish-controlled environment, taking all the information he's getting from the Turkish government. And in 1916, he manages to get to Britain and convince the British that he's going to give them the secrets that he knew, the trade and stuff like that. He was the person that was responsible for Allenby winning the Battle of Jerusalem. The problem that Allenby had was they couldn't transport the water, and he was able to tell them where the locality of the water was so that they didn't have to transport the water. So here he was subverting his own government by using scientific information, the knowledge of the water supply and the knowledge of where the sick people are and what people can carry. Very interesting story, not very well known. Military spy. This is one of my all-time favorite people, this nuclear submarine, Hyman Rickover. This is an absolutely astounding standard of no nuclear disasters, no nuclear problems, no nuclear negligence, no problems happened on that launch. And how he was able to change the mentality of normal, people get bored and careless. He was able to change the psychology of the people in the nuclear Navy so that it was absolutely perfect. He had an absolutely perfect safety record. And as a consequence, there's another element of pride is the nuclear Navy, and that is military display. And of course, war, I need not tell you any more about war. So the last thing that I'm going to tell you is, there is a book called Physics for Future Presidents. And I'm not going to do this. Which basically outlines the proposal that we make all these decisions based on what we hear and we don't really know. And he is a physicist and says that all of the hype about dirty bombs and stuff is hype. I'm not a physicist, so I'm not going to comment. But he falls into the same trap when he talks about biology and about smallpox. And he goes on and he says about smallpox is so terrible, and he paraphrases a lot of the stuff that was in that dark winter exercises, that one person can infect 10, will infect 10, will infect 10. The bottom line is, that's not what happens. The first, it's based on an assumption of linear transmission. So they found one epidemic where one person infected 10, and they assume that for the next 5 generations of transmission it's going to be 10, and it doesn't work that way. In no epidemic in the last 100 years, and there have been several, one was in Sweden, one was in Yugoslavia, one was in New York City in 1948, has there ever in a smallpox epidemic been more than 125 people who were killed? And so the point is, we have all these ideas and we get this stuff planted in our head, and somehow we forget to check for ourselves. And that's the message. And the final thing is, how come the scientists are telling us about all this bioterrorism stuff? And the reason is, a lot of the bioterrorism policy came in the 1970s when the World Health Organization put out the first list of bioterrorist weapons. And in 1970, the prime enemy of the United States was the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union had the capacity and were making bioweapons. And not only did they have the capacity to stir up the stuff in the lab, but they had the deployment mechanisms available. They had warheads, they had bombs, they had missiles. And in 1999, when the university started hurting, the scientists started to revive this hype. The only problem was in 1999, we didn't have the Soviet Union. We have terrorist organizations who do not have the deployment capacity to drop a bomb with a warhead, a 100-kilogram warhead, over New York City or Washington, which is the predicate for all of the bioterrorism policy we had today. If somebody dropped a bomb with a 50-kilogram warhead of anthrax over New York City, they would wipe out 500,000 people. But the problem is that likelihood of playing with a warhead in New York City, dropping a warhead, and everybody just sitting there going, oh my, look, there's a warhead there, is not very high. Because we're not dealing with Russia, with Soviet Union. We're dealing with the terrorist organizations who are not going to be using that kind of weapon. And so it's important to have not only an understanding of the science, but an understanding of the politics and the political mind of the terrorist. And that's the importance of the integration of the two things. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, in light of the fact that our conversation this afternoon is being recorded, if you wouldn't mind stating your name and affiliation prior to asking any questions, it would be much appreciated. But please, we have plenty of time for questions.
Yeah, I'm Russell King, a federal employee. I just have a question about one of the nations you didn't talk scientific statecraft nations. That's Japan, and in particular Japan's relationship with Iran, another one. Now, Iran's supposedly an Islamist state, and Japan is a country which probably doesn't even have a very much of an Islamic minority, but I think they've had a very close, collusive relationship. I saw on the internet there was a ninjutsu school, you know, the Japanese art of secret assassination. You see these Japanese women, they go through a ninjutsu routine, and at the end of the routine they pull off their veils and look as pretty and rugged as Angelina Jolie. Now that's got to be blasphemous to Allah, but I think the Iranian government is very pragmatic. They look at something like the ninjutsu school, well, they can get sabotage agents out of that. And George Bush and Barack Obama both tell us that Japan's our friend, and they both criticize Islamic extremism, but I think there's a little bit of relationship here that they're not
Look
pointing out to us.
look under the
Right.
look under the surface, and that's if somebody who's really studying both would study the policy and say, look, what does Japan have to gain? My husband always says, keep quid bono with benefits. Japan has a lot to gain because their national stature has decreased with their economic stature. And so they're making an alliance which is beneficial to both. And that's why somebody who's schooled in both would look at both and see, and as you saw, Japan was one of the people, as was Iran, on a list of an office with the Ministry of Science. So it behooves further investigation and not just looking at the surface. And I don't think anybody, this is personal, you can put aside your religious beliefs if it can accomplish your ultimate objective, in many cases. Yes.
I'm Bob Hershey, I'm a consultant. What can be done to get more science into public policy so that governments make good decisions and get us prospering?
That's a great question. The AAAS, the American Association of the Advancement of Science, has a program, I think it's with the American Bar Association, where they send their scientists to intern with governmental agencies and centers. I don't see it being very effective. I will tell you, having developed course materials to teach judges science, the general program to teach judges science is also not effective because the approach is, at least with judges, and as I gather this is the approach with that, is they invite the judges to have dinner with some noble luminary and everybody is so proud to go home, I had dinner with so-and-so, and they don't have a clue what the scientists are saying and it goes in with it. And what I skipped over is that there needs to be a course, not to teach genetics, but to teach the principles of science so that the policymaker knows how to ask the right questions. Now, I am a firm believer of the Star Trek theory of management of the universe. Any Trekkies there? Okay, thank you. Captain Kirk, or Admiral Kirk as he later became, did not know the jet propulsion formula for whatever. He would say, Scotty, can I do this, that, and the other? And Mr. Spock, what are the odds of? But he knew the questions to ask. He had enough to understand what the questions were. He knew the basic frameworks of what science could and couldn't do, and then he had his experts around him. The problem with Dark Winter and the problem with this malaria things, we don't even know the question test. Why doesn't bioterrorism work? You know why bioterrorism works? Because to drop a bomb with smallpox, it can't be raining. Because if it rains, the rain's going to push, the force of the rain is going to put it down. It has to be weaponized. You have to put silicone in or bentonite in it so it stays in the breathing zone. If there's a wind, it'll blow it away. You have to have an idea of deployment. Now, somebody who's a military expert and knows about deployment of weapons would have a very easy job understanding that the rules of deployment apply to bioweapons also. You don't get the stuff into people's breathing zones, it's not going to work. If it's something that you drink, if it's gastrointestinal anthrax and I can't get it into my food or my water, it doesn't make a difference. It's not going to happen. And so when people come in and say, well, I can take a nickel's worth of anthrax and wipe out America, well, that's great, but they have to breathe it in. And so there has to be a program, and I think it's not to teach the scientists, which is the focus now. I think it's to teach the policymakers. Because the policymakers at least understand the criminal mind, the enemy mind. And once you understand then you go and you get the expert. So the focus now is teaching the science policy, I think the other way it has to be. I think it has to be the policymakers to teach the rudiments, the scientific method, the scientific approach. And I suppose that's why Dr. Francesca has me here. Yes.
How do you propose instructing policymakers to the scientific method when a vast majority of not just the population but policymakers themselves are antagonistic towards science?
Arithmetically averse. Yes. So what I did for judges, which is the kind of same thing, is some of the policy I wrote in a fairy tale. Some of the basic science I wrote in a fairy tale, because otherwise I couldn't get over the hump of, as you said, I don't want to know this. If I wanted to know this, I would have gone to medical school. The same way when I went to Cornell, and in those days you had to pass the swimming test to graduate. Thank God, I don't do it anymore. But there were courses designed to teach adults who were afraid of water. And they had teachers who taught adults how to swim. The same way that there are ways, I said I wrote a lot of the stuff in fairy tale. Henny Penny versus the King, the sky is falling down. Dear me, how am I going to prove the science is falling? Well, there's an acorn here. And by putting it in a context that people can relate to, you can teach it. But you need a certain kind of specialized learning. It's almost like my sister teaches kids who have problems learning. And that arithmetically averse mind, which is what you talk about, the scientifically averse mind, can be gotten over, but you need a program that has to be done to deal with it.
And that still has to be developed.
And that still has to be developed.
Well, Hashim, I'm our instructor here. So my question is related to Chris's question. How do you go about preaching this scientific methodology in societies that are more hostile, particularly like Boko Haram, for instance, in Nigeria? Their platform is that every education that is proposed by Western,
The anti-Western education.
So how do you go about that, and more specifically in the Middle Eastern context of the Arab?
That's a great question. Actually, I'm actually writing a novel now about bioterrorism. And the interesting thing about Boko Haram is they're a lot smarter than we think they are in terms of stuff. Now, how did they use bioterrorism? They wanted to, there was some group that was sequestered in some area, and what they did is they sent some snakes in, and people freaked out, and they had bees when they came out. I mean, that's bioterrorism. It's not bioterrorism, we know, but it was a psychological way of doing things. They know a lot more, I am sure, than we know in some areas. And that's why a lot of the American allocation of funds is to develop new genetically engineered organisms. And it's like this why I'm saying Boko Haram is not going to be worried about developing genetically engineered microorganisms. They will use bioterrorism, they'll use salmonella, they'll use snakes, they'll use bees. And it's our failure for not understanding that kind of mindset. Know your enemy. This mindset is not going to create a genetically engineered, they're not going to have a laboratory, but they will use it, and it's for us to understand where that mindset is. And that's one of the reasons why we're in this, is because we're not paying attention to a different mindset, a different culture, who is going to use bioterrorism, but on their, if we're fighting them, we've got to fight on their level. And that's, we think we're so great, we're going to do genetically engineered stuff, and they'll beat us the same, because they're fighting very cleverly. Using scientific principles. I mean, science is, I don't know, zillions of years old, but science, fear, snakes. I think snakes is the single universal fear of everybody. I don't know whether it comes from the snake in the Garden of Eden, but apparently there is some evidence that, and that's what they used. And so it's for us to understand where they're coming from and fight on that level.
So understanding culturally where they come from.
And bring ourselves to that level instead of saying, well, they're going to start doing what we're doing. No.
I'm Ed Shandel, and I'm an Army fellow here at the Institute. I'm also an engineer. Is your premise to say that we should form some sort of institute or center or federal agency for science and technology, or is your premise to say that of the numerous agencies that have a science and technology wing or arm, if you will, to be more of advisors to our political establishment?
I think there are two ways to do it. I think one way is to create an office of, or a ministry or a cabinet level science and technology like these 18 other countries do. Or the other way is to resurrect the Congressional Office of Technology and Assessment, which was made up of 6 Republicans and 6 Democrats and was an oversight. So when we basically throw all this money at bioterrorism and say, wait a minute, we're fighting Boko Haram and they're not going to be genetically engineering stuff. We don't need to do that. What we need, we have 14 biosafety weapon, biosafety level 4 laboratories that are capable of working on Ebola since 2005. We have this Ebola outbreak going on. We don't have a drug. The drug they're using is an experimental drug manufactured by the Canadians. What have we been doing there? Anthrax, we don't have a specific, they use the same microbes that they're using now, Cipro and Tetra. What have we been doing in our laboratories? Who is coming up with some, we are working on genetically engineering stuff when our adversaries are not the Soviet Union that might have been doing that, but they are the Boko Harams who are going to be doing other things, and we need to come up with solutions that are useful. So I don't think you can be done on, I mean, DARPA does some stuff and BARDA does some stuff, but it's fragmented, and then we need to have some kind of overall idea, like for example, China and Russia, the statements when they came out in 1998, 2000, that they were going to start ministries, they said science is important. And that just even the creation of a ministry or cabinet level sends a message. And we don't have that. And just the fact that we don't have it, I mean, just the fact that we don't have it, to me, is troubling. It's just like, it doesn't bother you?
I understand your broad premise, and I, as a scientist myself, I applaud it, but to say that we would establish new structure in our government just to prove a point, I mean, a lot of things that are great about our political system is that we are fragmented, and there is chaos in the system.
Absolutely.
And to some, that's very inefficient, and I get it. But the other is that because we're fragmented,
So,
you can work on a variety of things all at the same time.
so with the food, like for example, food safety, I think there are like 14 different agencies that have jurisdiction over food agency. And every time there's a food output, they say, well, we need one agency to coordinate. And you can make the argument that there's a benefit to 14 different agencies. But at this point, there is no congressional, no legislative arm that looks at our policy decisions. So my recommendation would be to resurrect the Office of Technology, which we had and worked brilliantly. And when we start doing avian flu stuff and we don't even have avian flu, maybe we should spend it on something else. And if you had a bipartisan group or a congressional group, something not under the executive branch, which is where it is now, move that into a congressional branch, which once was, I think you'd have a better handle.
Steve Winters, local researcher. Just to warm to your theme, actually when I was thinking about this, I picked up one of the leading defense journals, U.S. defense journals recently, and was surprised to see that there was an article by Nathan Myhrvold in there. And Nathan Myhrvold, you probably know who he is, but I guess he runs this company called Intellectual Ventures now. But some people say there are 10 people in the U.S., 10 top brains, for instance, Wolfram, Myhrvold, so forth and so on, that actually create a totally different situation for the U.S. than if these 10 people didn't exist. And maybe now we have Elon Musk and stuff, but whatever. But his article was directed to, defense analysts in the defense community, and what he said was, wait a minute, similar to what you're saying, you guys you're missing something here. A kid today, not kid, but a kid today, mad young scientist, Steve Jobs in his garage, but with some malicious intent, can create a weapon that will destroy the whole of humanity. And nobody's dealing with this fact, this issue. I mean, there's nobody in the government that is directed to this issue. And I think that, I'm not saying he's right or wrong, but certainly he thinks he's right. And it illustrates, I think, exactly the point you're making. There's this total gap here. Who in the government actually can respond to this when there's nobody to respond to it? So I'm just saying, I think that actually illustrates your point very well. And I'm sorry I can't cite the article, but you can pull it up in the bibliography. And it's a recent article.
Thank you.
Yeah, kind of just a coattail and then a separate comment. I think that is how a lot of policy is given priority in DC, is that the squeaky wheel gets the grease, and so you get a bunch of whatever special interests who want funding for telecommunications or some sort of department to deal with the other world.
And in the days of the OTA, it went to them and they would say, is this valid or isn't? And now it goes to the president's office and the president has his own agenda, and that's fine, except nobody's looking over everybody.
Yeah, except, it seems like your program or your solution presupposes that this agency or this training is somehow going to ensure, for lack of a better word, objective and moral operation. In other words, it says that even though you may have these trained scientists, there's no way that these scientists would be bought out by private interests, or that these scientifically trained politicians wouldn't sacrifice the truth
No,
for
no,
their
no,
own.
no, I don't say that in the slightest. I don't say that.
Well, I mean, well then there's a big problem with your program, because I think, especially in this country, which really lauds self-interest, to sacrifice your political career or to make a decision that would cost you money or whatever, requires a level of integrity that.
And that's why a bipartisan commission supposedly should work, because you have both sides.
In today's bipartisan world, it's even less likely, it seems to me.
Maybe, except that you have a program, all right? If it's really good, both sides, because it's science. Remember, both sides will want to know. If it's really fostering a private interest, either side, that's where you'll get it. That's where you'll get a call. Now, I wrote the healthcare program. I wrote a policy for healthcare. The problem with the healthcare program that's now is that it doesn't understand how healthcare works. And so it's not like my side works and my. Assume you want the objection of better coverage for everybody. You need to understand where is the money falling down. And the money is falling down because the insurance company's administrative costs are exceeding inflation by 25%. That's the first thing. Everyone's a malpractice case. Malpractice is worth 1.5%. You have to understand the system. And there are certain things that everybody wants. Better health care. Okay, the Republicans want this and the Democrats want that. But there are certain things that you can agree on. Maybe not everybody's going to get better care, but some people will get better care if you start integrating things. And if you start looking at creative solutions. So what I propose is a joint public-private initiative, where the doctors don't have to take less money, and the government can pick up certain things, but somebody's got to pay. And where the money came out of in my program was the administrative cost, the processing cost, the filling out the form, not the medical records cost. But because everybody's coming now out of their own vested little interest, and there's nobody able to look at both sides and come up with a solution, we're stuck. That's where you have the North going Zacks and the South going South. I want my side, I want my side. And I think at the end of the day, there are things we can all agree on, but we need a new solution, not yours and not mine, a different one. And somebody who's trained with both worlds can see things that people who aren't trained in both worlds can't. And that's where all of these people were successful. That's where Aronson was successful, and that's where Franklin was successful, because they came from a different kind of training. They had a totally different kind of training than you can imagine. And they had the experience in the political world. It wasn't just scientific training. They spent many years, all of them, in the political world. So they had the benefit of different mentality, different mindset.
Well,
You
go ahead. I was just going to say, science is fairly conclusive on a lot of things, but you still get both sides arguing vehemently their versions of science.
Absolutely, that was my
And so-
argument with Metchnikoff and Paul Koch. They're both right.
That meeting of minds, well, that's a special case. I'm talking about instances where the science is very definitive, but the other side will look at the more skeptical parts of it or the problem areas and highlight those. And so there really isn't an agreement of the data, there's just an agenda to be set. Or
The problem is the data, and actually I'm working on something about that, the data now. Okay, so what I'm working on now is a program to translate statistics into into a legal way of looking at things, which politicians can relate to. But right now, the scientific data is in a different world that doesn't have any hook in the legal world. There's no translation. It's two different languages. And so I'm working on now a project of taking that data and translating it into, then somebody else can take the data and use it. But right now we're using, the lawyers and politicians are using the scientific data and having no clue about what it means, and they each twist it to their own benefit. Where if you took it and you made it accessible to a legal policy person, then everybody knows, it's clearer.
Yeah, in scientific statecraft, I know you have a need to communicate to the rest of the world what you're doing to some extent. And I thought I heard that we're cutting down the Voice of America, but you have like the Voice of America and the U.S. Information Service. But I'm wondering just to what extent do we want to advertise what we're doing to the rest of the world, sort of get our propaganda out there, and to what extent do we want to keep a little mum on it, because we're having competitive problems with other nations. I'm sure some of what we do will have legitimate competition there, and in some cases, we might harm or help
And
various
that's-
other nations.
And that's where you need an umbrella organization to decide, okay, this is what the paradigm is, this is our objective, how much do we lead, how much don't we lead, how much do we mislead? And that's where you need somebody who understands, who has a bigger picture of where we're going, knows what to put out and what not to put out, as opposed, right now it's, we put out whatever we feel like putting out, or whatever suits us good, or whatever's gonna make us feel good, or individual something, that's why you need the umbrella.
We've got time for about one more question.
Okay, do we have one more question? Yes, not?
And if not, thank you very much.
Okay.
Dr.